He's a true slayer of the non-dual zombies. Hello, everybody. Today I'm speaking with one of the most beautiful and sharpest minds that I ever came across. Taylor is our in-house Pandita at CC, and Pandita means a yogic philosopher. What makes him unique is that he's not just a contemplative CrossFit guy, but he also competes in physical CrossFit. He's also a firefighter, a photographer, a designer, a true Renaissance man with incredible eye for form, beauty, danger, pressure, and precision. The way his mind works at the subtlest level possible erases that gap between the conscious and the subconscious. Taylor is leading a cohort in the art of view refinement to orient the mind to the right view. His teachings focuses on how the architectures of meanings and identities are constructed and how blind spots protect themselves and how insights has to become embodied through virtue, relationships, and actions. We talk about the intellect, when sharpened, becomes the missing link in spiritual practices. Developing an intellect is not a substitute for realization, but as a way of sharpening discernment, enhance deductive reasoning skills, and learning how to think and contemplate clearly about experience and the ways our mind constructs meaning. Because awakening alone does not automatically untangle conditionings and the conceptual frameworks through which we interpret reality. The intellect, properly developed, becomes part of the path itself, a tool to shatter all boundaries and reshape reality. This is particularly relevant in modern spiritual culture, where thoughts, concepts, philosophy, and intellectual development are often treated as obstacles to awakening rather than an instrument that can be refined and embodied. And the result is that people become lobotomized and complacent, all in the name of spirituality and non-duality, and we refer to these folks as non-dual zombies. Other ways to describe non-dual zombies are people who are memeing spirituality or pirating non-dual zombie memes that you hear on the internet. Like, oh, there's nothing to do, there's no one here, and concepts are bad. Without realizing that you're conceptualizing about having no concept and that unexamined views continue to operate even without thoughts. The key is to see through to the empty nature of thoughts, not to silence them. Or people who don't want to feel, they bypass emotions or responsibilities in life. Now, I used to be a non-dual zombie too, and there's nothing wrong with it, but it gets old. If you're trapped in a non-dual zombie land, you stop refining your views. They stop upgrading their mind-body organism. You gotta study, reflect, and meditate. And it's part of the integration and embodiment because you do still have a body and a mind, even though you're beyond the body and the mind. But again, the true middle way is that which in sense, but include. And then there's half-natty non-dual zombies who actually has a genuine opening, insights, or even initial stages of awakening. However, without further refinement, their insights can actually obscure reality. So in the second half of this video, Taylor lays out 4 ways insights can actually distort reality if it isn't integrated. Subtle superiority, number 1, where we start identifying as the one who quote-unquote gets it. Number 2, disengagement, where you hijack emptiness so you can distance yourself from life. 3, nihilistic drift, where nothing seems to matter. And hyperclarity, where we can see patterns or even have insights clearly, but we lose contact with life and love. Alright, enough of me soapboxing. Here's Taylor.
How are you feeling after 6 days of this?
Tired as shit, but also inspiring.
Okay, so we have this BDSM thing, right? The AIM stands for modernity, and another one is maestro, and you're like a really good representation of a maestro. Because I think one of the things that attracted me to you at first was like you're really into photography and you're really good at it. Yeah, you have a really good eye.
What's on your mind?
Nothing.
And you're also a firefighter, and then you also do like CrossFit and fitness, whatever it is else you do. And then on top of Dharma. And now you just led the public practice week with your first transmission. So how did all this come together? And who is Taylor?
Who is Taylor?
Yeah, what is Taylor? Of all these different elements.
I don't know. I don't really have a sense of who this is. I'm just, what is it? Mitching always says, you are what you do. So there you go.
The functions.
Yeah. Firefighting, CrossFit. I don't know what photography would be. Aesthetics, noticing, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, because another thing that I noticed is like your fitness is like world class, and not just physically, but like now.
I was gonna ask, what kind of fitness are we talking
about?
about?
We're talking about realization fitness for now. Yeah, because you're a firefighter, you're able to, I guess, process or have the capacity to handle fear. Can you talk a little bit about how you, as a professional firefighter, relates to what you do here? Because people who get into this path, they're like, oh, firefighting, that seems such an opposed thing to like, oh, sitting there in silence, but actually it's not at all.
You think so? Oh.
That's why people are like, oh, you're a firefighter? Holy shit. But then your demeanor is like, now you're like a teacher, right? So like,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess.
But that's what made you effective, right?
Is that a question you get a lot? Like, what? I guess that comes down to the point of like, what's the point of sitting, right? Was it day 3 that we did yoga on the beach with everyone?
Right, yeah.
And I realized while we were doing yoga is very much just like CrossFit. CrossFit is very much like physical training, CrossFit, you know, with in a gym, so on and so forth. It's what we do. It's CrossFit of the mind. At least people in the CC container already realize this. The way you move, it's not just energy through the body, but this ability to navigate the infinite, as you would say, causes and conditions, right? Well, it's through all of those things, firefighting, literal CrossFit, photography, that you cultivate what are eventually just these qualities that, as we were talking right before this, are the outflow of the Dharma Dhatu, right? First 12 weeks of the boot camp, or the initial boot camp people enter, we talk a lot about like the cultivating of this vessel for fire, right? And it really is the cultivating of this vessel that allows for the natural expression of these qualities. Yeah. And so like in that way, the work it can't be apart from life. As for the fear,
putting out fire, even in like the boot camp, right?
Yeah.
What is that about? Like, what do you need to put out fire as an instructor, or
well, I think
fear?
I think the acolytes know what it feels like to be on fire, right? And then that fire, it's which was actually going to get what I was going to get to the point about like the fear in firefighting. It's like I actually don't have that much fear in regards to like actually going into a fire, right? If anything, it was anxiety about being able to do my job previously, right? And the fear never goes away. I was just talking to Khan about this over lunch. Like the fear never goes away, the anxiety never goes away, but it's through not just the cultivation of these qualities, but in the preparation of this vessel of what is at the time of the path, at the start of the path and during the path, the condition being to be that conditional vessel that can move and adapt through the various causes and conditions of life, to be able to be that expression of these qualities that are cultivated through, I mean, we have the opportunity to recreationally do that. I mean, you could do that through going into a burning building where it's very consequential and you feel the consequence of that. And maybe some people need that sort of pressure, right? But then we also live in a time where the ability to just recreate it, like through the gym, is available. Yeah.
So you could cultivate all these qualities, right? What are the 5 qualities?
I mean,
virtue,
it depends, right? If you're talking about the paramitas, I think it's virtue, concentration, discipline, exertion. You push for the sake of pushing. Yeah.
What does it do for you in life?
Virtue for the sake of virtue.
Say it again.
It's like virtue for the sake of virtue.
Yes.
That's the whole point of how I've been doing my training now. There is a perfection of wisdom, right?
We cultivate these by recreationally.
And these, I mean, we talked about this at the end of D. We don't talk about it so much during the main boot camp. This is more of that's what the initiates are training in, right? And these qualities aren't actually any particular thing, right? You could say these qualities are, and the way that we distinguish them, they're the emergent qualities of experience when there's the union of emptiness and compassion, or of wisdom and merit. Yeah, and those things are only cultivated through living your life, which is why it's like when we cling to like the what is the point of meditation, and we have an insistence on what the point of meditation is, or being in a particular state, that's always going to exacerbate this splitting, right? My life, my practice, this divide between the two. So actually, for me, the fear, a lot of the fear, anxiety, and even fear and anxiety, like at the time of, you could say, the path, or just in our lives, we experience like fear and anxiety as like a thing. Just like when I'm saying the point, what is the thing that is the point? We experience fear and anxiety as a thing. And so like, I think during public practice week, we talked about how, I use the example of like, you walk into a room, there's a vibe of the room, has a particular energetic signature. You might determine it as excitement, I might determine it as anxiety, right? But it's just the general vibe, it's the indeterminate vibe. And then through the way in which we are conditioned, so on and so forth, we determine, we decide what it is. And that gives us an orientation of how to be in the moment, right? And that's how we perpetuate as being a conditioned being, because the previous moment is conditioned by the prior moment, so on and so on, so on and so on. And
so you actually have to take all that into consideration and account for all that when you sit down and even before you.
And then you see how it's CrossFit.
Okay, all this, literally the inner penetration of this different lines of concentration. So how do you hold that together and then like, I guess, invert it, right? Maybe we can talk about the mechanics some other time.
That's a big topic.
Okay, well.
Which we talked about a little bit on the retreat, like what even is transmission. But
we did. I was just going to ask you about D actually. Is there anything you wanted to add about the last point of fear?
We relate to fear as a thing, and it has an energy, and relating to it as a thing gives that fear a holding pattern, right? And that's what like our karma is.
It's just a holding pattern.
It's a holding pattern, right? And when you relate to it as a separate thing, I mean, depending on how you're conditioned, you may relate to it as wanting to get rid of it, right? But it never goes away. In relating to it in a way that wants to get rid of it, or as a separate thing that you have to exert through, it's like then it feels like you have to muster this energy to go into the fear or work through the fear. But actually the fear, in that indeterminate sense, is the energy of, like, that is where the fuel is. That's what it means. That is the fuel, right? Yeah, I guess that was the only point I would make.
Is that when you perceive affliction as wisdom, kind of?
Yeah, and that's why we pay homage to it, or at least part of the reason why. Yeah.
And we just said the relationship between merits and wisdom is kind of like, merits is like a container that allows you to cultivate your wisdom through.
In a way, in a way. So, but like it's also just, it's a container, but it's the container of your life, which is the totality of everything.
Which is the wisdom, right? Yeah, because that's one of the major splits.
You can't actually separate wisdom and merit. Right? You can't actually separate them. You can, in a pedagogical sense, have a particular emphasis on what you are attempting to cultivate, but the merit aspect is, I think, how I talk about it in D, is as this relational coherence, right? And
what is that relational coherence?
Reality is not fundamentally flawed. We have this. There's this fundamental basis of reality that, again, is not a thing. It's not a substantial thing, but it's this fundamental basis of reality. It is sort of the foundational, how I've been talking about it, is foundational coherence that allows us to even make the choice to be ignorant, make the choice to suffer. It's also how it's why the path is even possible. Like, there can't be the cultivation of these qualities without the ability for free will, right? To cohere reality in a particular way, to orient and so on and so forth. And we do generate our own sense of meaning, even if we are memeing it, even if there is this relational resonance through which we all participate into this holding pattern. And that's like culture, right? Culture is a holding pattern of meaning. And this would be a tangent, but like, that's where we find us today. We find ourselves, maybe not us. Well, I mean, we're not a part of this, but there's knowing it. Yeah, and now the world is running out of meaning.
Is that why a lot of people become nihilistic?
Yeah, or even going back to like relating to fear as something to get rid of. If you hold that as something to rid yourself of course you're going to trend towards an nihilistic view, right? Because in order to get rid of that, you have to get rid of the self. And like there's a difference between recognizing the nature of the self and wanting, I don't know, to destroy the self,
or dissociate from it, distance yourself from it, or eternalism, where you try to expand the self to infinity and think that you are God. All kinds of different orientations we have because of a particular meaning in this ontological container. So what's Cohort D? I know it's one of the parallel cohorts where you specializes in view refinement. We're receiving the same transmission from HN, but the discussion spaces are different. You're teaching people how to see how they make meaning with their minds.
So
and then you can make instantiate your meaning.
Yeah, you could say one is A would be sort of the primary intent is the cultivation of merit, and D would be wisdom. But of course, again, there has there's very much a relationship between A and D. The A acolytes must participate in D,
vice versa,
and not necessarily vice versa. But in D, there needs to be relating. It works only up until a point if there's no relating.
Because D is going into it, people might assume it's a view refinement focused cohort, or like philosophy, right? Yogic philosophy. But then how does that relate to like led by Adrian, which is cultivating your relational fitness? Why do they need to come to D? And
why do you think they need to come to D?
Why do I think? It's pretty obvious to me why do they go to D, but
well, what's obvious about it?
If you're relating with people and then there's blind spots that you can see, like there's a lot of the views that you don't see about yourself or other people. Because that's how we relate, through views.
The relational aspect of it, the establishing this relational coherence is where it's like, what would be the cause for change? Right?
In terms of like how we relate to others.
Relate to ourselves, relate to others, like hold meaning. What would be the cause, right? Relationality. Yeah.
So if you don't change
this relationship, right? Yeah. Because what I do affects you, what you do affects me. Like I guess that's kind of a simplistic way of putting it, but it's true.
Yeah, even like.
But then being able to actually trace the way, that's a lot of what I guess the public practice week was about actually making contact with our experience. Like it all starts there. But then being able to
with contact, there is relation.
Trace the way that we are both consciously and unconsciously insisting and choosing and generating meaning, the consequence, right? Like to be able to trace our conditioning, our architecture of meaning. Like that's why I think the A people participate in D. Yeah.
Yeah, even my own example is like my romantic relationship is like, in order for the relationship to progress, we need to refine our views.
And that only happens in relation with one another, right? Yeah.
Even when you
because
just
it's sort of like that pinning, that holding of each other accountable, that we will meet the edge of our fitness.
The reason why I put that in there, I can take it out, is
I know what you mean, but
I'll mark it down.
No, that part is actually just confusing.
Okay, yeah. Okay, cool.
Like we start to, as we work the problem together, start to trace this blind spot of like, oh, I literally can't. It could be as simple as like, I can't. Well, we find where meaning may be non-negotiable. That was something we do in D. We talked about in D, where is meaning non-negotiable, or like we literally cannot cognize otherwise. Like the flexibility of our interpretation. Like we meet our edge and there's just dissonance. We can't think. Yeah. But then we have to remain in that tension and work that problem together, right? And so then the relationship, in a way, in that sense, is the cause. Yeah.
And also, I think if you don't like work on your views or know exactly what the views are, it's like even if you think you are changing, you're just reinforcing whatever views are already in conflict. You try to solve that. It's compounding on top of compounding.
Which is a good point. So then it's like a lot of this. What did Albert say?
Explain this 5-6 days to them.
You don't want to come here. You don't want to come here. It's like literally inconceivable, and it's if you like working, the reward.
It's supposed to be a vacation, but I haven't stopped working.
Dude, that's.
But I'm also having a lot of fun. Even right now.
I think you asked him like, what would you say to acolytes who may want to come on retreat?
You say, don't come here.
Yeah.
Is it because they don't have the view yet? Or,
it's like
you might freak out if you don't have the view.
I don't know if this is obvious to most people, but it's probably an obvious felt sense that people don't know how to love and like give and receive love. People don't know how to love. People don't know how to like there's this yearning for friendship, and there are a lot of aspects of friendship that are very uncomfortable. Like there was a lot of uncomfortable conversations and pinning that happened on this retreat.
I definitely compartmentalize my money-making activities from like what did he call like CC or the sound meditations or
like that's
shocking, right?
Yeah. That's the insistence right now. Yeah. That's the split.
People will crash out, right?
Is
that what the term? Crash out?
Yeah, the burnout. I don't know.
Yeah. Flip out, freak out.
Yeah.
It's like straight to the point of exactly what you don't want to look at.
So like I want to go for D.
Yeah,
but you have a presentation every week, right?
For the first, I think it's like the first 8 weeks, there's 1 to 2 kind of presentations because there's the D pedagogy is situated somewhere between the main bootcamp and foundation. They're absolutely coherent, but
it's the same transmission as
that's why it works
one.
with it works with the same transmission, but you could say it's like the emphasis of each week as presented in and they're not too long. Some of them, I think they're typically between 30 to 60 minutes.
Do you record them or do you present them? Like,
previously, I just recorded them.
Yeah.
I just recorded them.
Is this gonna like give a talk or?
I may just use this.
Your slides are crazy good, actually. Yeah. They're work of art.
I make the information, but then just let AI kind of make.
No, but I know. Yeah, I can tell it's a little bit AI, but it's still like just looking at those pictures. It's like that's in itself already like okay, I can see where the teaching is.
Yeah,
like,
it's coherent, right? Yeah, that's what I mean.
Because Dharma is like very spatial, temporal. It's like a geometry, right? And you can just like I do that with my video, but then when I saw you, I was like, okay, oh, there's another part of you I didn't see, the design part. Which is the design part of you. It's like, oh, Taylor's a designer.
In a way, yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
I have a design interest, I guess. This is me pursuing, and it depends. I think about programming, periodization, like even your life, how you design your life. So I guess it's all design in that sense. Yeah.
Even when we talk about the meeting of the views, right? Like there's a certain geometry to like
Yeah, you can give it form, right?
Yeah, a view is a certain geometry
a
of
view has a
how
form.
you aggregate as
Yeah.
a form, exactly.
You want to know about the structure? Or
Maybe, just give me a little bit about like the structure, or like you were talking about how it's the same transmission, but you give presentation and like.
the
Like
structure.
what do we
So
do indeed?
we do relate, but I guess it's a different kind of relating. It's a relating in the way where we are training with one another in a relational sense. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's not much different from A in this sense. Like really get to know ourselves. Like that's the tracing of our conditioning. And in order to do that, right? In order to, you could say it's a troubleshooting process. And in that troubleshooting process, understanding both the
What are you
simply
troubleshooting?
your felt sense of incompleteness. Yeah. Without doing the thing of like you're already complete.
Yeah, of course.
There is that fundamental basis that we're talking about where it's like reality is not flawed, but people aren't conscious of the way that they insist, make choices, right? That generates and perpetuates a certain, not just state, but experience, right? Meaning. And so that's why even in the public practice, I talked about how suffering isn't inherently a problem, but only in distinguishing that as a problem, in distinguishing it as, and that's why we can't escape these, this mechanism of mind that is not fundamentally a problem, but is also what, it gets tricky, right?
How you orient? Like, I like what you said about context. Like we're always in contact.
We're always in contact.
Absorbed, but what
always
you are
absorbed.
absorbing to the geometry of the object.
How we are being, right, is what
is
the basis for these emergent qualities of our experience. And when you could say it's like when there is this completion, right? What is completion? That's a big topic. But like when there is this completion, when there is this, I don't know, how would you say it? This alignment? Sure. But this perfect alignment isn't a state, right? It's what allows for the outflow of these qualities.
Because you can have a state that's quote unquote negative.
Yeah.
That you can experience discomfort, but then you still be
any
coherent,
insistence
right?
on a state is itself a holding pattern,
right?
And it's in that holding pattern that we then obstruct the expression of these qualities, the outflow of these qualities. Yeah. But then it's like, how are we being? How are we making that choice to continually invest into that holding pattern, right? And that's why it's like people don't see how they're making choices, how they are actually always manifesting exactly the life that they want. But then that's also...
That's why he says suffering is a choice.
That's exactly, you're right. But that's also tied up into like things like wrong view. It's like viewing yourself as a singular entity. But if you understand yourself as like a bundle of karma, a collection of desires, right? It's like you don't have this actual, true, substantial separation between even just conscious and unconscious, right? Where it's like, then you feel like you are afflicted by, that's like what intrusive thoughts are. It's like where do those thoughts come from? People think like they're being possessed by something other than themselves, which not entirely wrong, like in a way that's true, but it's because there is no singular independent core that is apart from, you know what I mean? Like, yeah.
So when people have intrusive thought, they're like, these are just coming in like spontaneously.
Yeah,
but then
right?
you're saying like with learning about how the mind works at that level of subtlety, you can actually not even decide, but you know exactly how these intrusive thoughts are conditioned.
Yeah, they're not intrusive. They're just, you could say they're just your thoughts. You could say that, but yours in the sense of like not a separate possessor of these thoughts, right?
Just that you're not apart from the conditions, you're not apart from the affliction, but the freedom is like you say in the diagram, like you wake up within the loop, not outside of the loop. And not try to dissolve or even untangle the loop, right?
Yeah.
One more question. Public practice week. So that was your first time like giving a transmission publicly.
Publicly, yeah. Because
I know
we had done foundation. We had been doing foundation a bit, right?
Like we don't have to get into mechanics of publicly.
Publicly.
But you did that indeed. Like how?
Yeah, because we've been doing it a bit with NCC, both for. So I guess you could say some of what D is. There is all the presentation and materials, like it is very much a transmission, but giving transmission in that form. I have been doing for a little bit with foundation, yeah.
So, like, how did you learn how to do that? Just by doing the bootcamp or like instruction from HM, both in your own experience? Like, obviously, like, you kind of made it into your own thing, right?
Yeah.
Which is not apart from the main transmission, but
I don't think
you're learning.
I didn't receive any direct instructions from Mei Cheng of how to give transmission until after How did I learn? I mean, you could say that's what we're teaching in the boot camp, essentially.
Yeah, interesting. I think Mei-Chin once said that, I asked him, how do you do your transmission? I just be myself.
Yeah, that's really it. Yeah, like you just be yourself. Yeah.
Interesting. So people know you as a philosophy guy, right?
Yeah,
but you don't really like put it yeah. So right now, like when people think about philosophy, even we study a lot of these like scholastic stuff, and everything we're talking about, it seems like very embodied, very practical. But we still do need study philosophy, right? We read all these luminous heart, they're very philosophical.
Yeah.
That was the first thing that we read together, right? The Dharma Dhatu, Impresa Dharma Dhatu, and then I remember in the beginning we were just like going over it, like the conceptual realm of like this broader thing, like this yogic thing, which is not apart from the transmission and relational skills and embodiment. Like, but when people see you here, and
you'll meet an edge without studying. I'll just say that.
What do you mean? What do you mean? You meet an edge without studying?
Yeah, I mean.
If you don't study, you're gonna reach the edge of your fitness.
I don't know why people think this is any different from the rest of life. It's like.
That's the separation again, right?
Yeah.
It's like, spirituality is not about philosophy or like whatever. That's what it is. Okay, so how would you summarize this coherence? It's like, okay, philosophy.
Even Shakyamuni studied throughout his life, So I don't know why people think they don't need to study.
I don't know why. Same thing. The reason why people think you don't need to practice it when you get into like awakening work, they just assume we don't need to practice.
Yeah, it's like they have their initial awakening and like I don't.
It's like this is the entirety of your life. How can you not practice?
Yeah. And it's like sure, like every moment is. I don't know, like.
Is
I
it,
guess,
but
like
but that's the two truths, right?
Two truths. Yeah. Sorry, what was the last question?
The last question, I don't remember. Like when people associate you with being the intellectual capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in
the intellectual conceptual guy.
I don't think I'm that smart, man. Like people keep saying, I don't think I'm that smart. But I think philosophy in the sense of how people often think of philosophy, I'm absolutely not a philosopher. But if you understand, like what is the etymology of philosophy, philosophia, right? The love of knowledge. I think
wisdom,
the way,
right?
The love of wisdom, the love of knowledge. I think the
Sophia.
way, the way people often relate to philosophy, it's as this. What's the way they relate to everything else? It's the love of this thing, right? And they objectify knowledge. But when there's that genuine love for, it's almost like for knowledge to breathe and flow. This love of knowledge actually traces the edge of knowing in that way, right? And it's in tracing the edges of this knowing, allowing for it to breathe, allowing for it to become translucent to itself in a way. Well, that's what allows for the expression of wisdom. Yeah.
I remember when the first time I came across Sophia, like the love of wisdom, was when I took my first philosophy course. We talked about like Socrates, and then at the end, the conclusion was love of wisdom is love of love itself.
Yeah. Because it's exactly that objectification of knowledge that is what kind of
like the split, right?
Yeah, that is the split. Suffering. That it's like that's suffering, that's the splitting, that's the way we reject love, right? And that's why any philosophical system is not meant to be an all-encompassing philosophy of life, right? They all have these boundaries. You could say they're boundaries of context, they're boundaries of invalidation. Yeah. And so then if there's a genuine love for knowledge and not an insistence on, this is the source of meaning, back to the source of meaning.
What do you mean by boundary of invalidation? Like, I assume people know the process of invalidation.
Logic works.
How do you know when you reach the boundary of invalidation?
Well, it's often at that boundary point where we meet the inevitable contradiction of any system, the inevitable paradox and contradiction of any system, right? That's why it's like within any philosophical system, you'll meet contradiction.
And then that's when people get stuck, right? They can't hold contradiction, or they don't have the fitness to stay with contradiction. And let them cohere, right?
Yeah, and that's why actually stepping, like, at least how it was for me, the path, right? There is a, like being able to step past that threshold of meaning does, for some it feels like death, for some it feels like going insane. For me, it felt like going insane. Yeah. Because it's like outside of that ground of meaning, I don't know, things don't.
It's the crossing into the unknown, right?
Yeah, that's uncertainty, that's the unknown.
Simplest way to put it.
That's
Do you still get those edges? I'm sure it's a more subtle now, but like,
those edges of knowing.
Yeah.
It's more like it's also at those edges where you meet those like fear. anxiety, terror,
which you said they can
which
still
never
be
goes
there,
away,
never
right?
goes away,
Which never goes away. Yeah. But it's almost like,
it's like almost
being
like
able
binging
to.
into
I don't like speaking like this, but being able to flow through these knowledge structures, if you will. It's a skill of being comfortable with that tension. Yeah.
You know, we talk about flexibility of aggregation views. In order to have that flexibility to like serve from one system of knowledge to another, one view to another, you have to be
fit.
Yeah.
I think people get a flavor of how much work you do, but only a flavor. It's insane the amount of work that you're doing, and within CC in your own life, you're not getting paid. I'm just wondering if you can share with people what it is that keeps you going.
CC offers a container for you to, and I guess that kind of answers the question a bit about like what is completion, and it's like just fully being yourself. Like it genuinely is just fully being yourself, but people don't know how to be themselves, right? Yeah, people don't know how to be themselves in relationship with the world. Yeah, and so that's why. I mean, I think you guys have seen it. Like, it's really weird to me how. I mean, I guess it makes sense how spirituality for a lot of people just becomes an escape from their life. That was also a theme of the Public Practice Week. Yeah. But then how do you learn to be yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, one more thing to say about that. Like sometimes I put this path is like being completely yourself, but then also going beyond the self.
Yeah.
But then in between that, those two extremes, there's a relation part.
Yeah, it's
like,
going beyond the self in the sense. Well, how do you see it? Going beyond the self.
Beyond, but include the self. Like you have to embody your particular karma or disposition, whatever, on the quote unquote personal level of being. But at the same time, you have to go beyond that. Otherwise, you can't be yourself if you don't go beyond that simultaneously.
Yeah.
But in between these two extremes, there is love, right? There is like relational skills.
Yeah.
And that's all part of it. Yeah. Are you serious?
Yeah, where it's like, this is what Frank means when he always says this.
Beyond, but include.
Wait.
This is what Frank means when he always says this.
To who? To like.
Acolytes. Indeed.
Oh, indeed. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm gonna.
World, like you have this shtick almost.
Yeah.
I wanna.
Like because a lot of those things that you're constantly saying, like some people get it, but a lot of people just goes right over their head.
Okay, interesting. Wait, is the video?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Good timing.
All right, that was good. Did you get a picture?
Over the past 6 weeks, we've been gradually dismantling a set of assumptions that perhaps most of us did not realize we were carrying. Not merely intellectual assumptions about the nature of reality, but experiential assumptions about how experience itself is structured. So we began this training very simply, starting by stabilizing attention, not because stability is the point and not because a calm mind is inherently superior to a restless one, but because stability allows experience to reveal its own nature. Without stability, perception fragments, attention jumps from object to object, and when attention fragments, we never remain with experience long enough to see how it organizes itself. Stability providing the vessel within which experience can be examined. And once that vessel was established, we began looking at the moment where experience actually begins. The moment when a sense organ, an object, and consciousness meet. From that meeting, something subtle appears almost immediately. Feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, not yet an interpretation, not yet a narrative, but a pre-conceptual tilt, an inclination, and that tilt begins shaping what happens next. Attention moves towards what feels pleasant, away from what feels unpleasant. Neutral experiences tend to dissolve into the background, seemingly unconsequential. And from there, perception begins organizing the world. Perception selects features, it groups them, it compares them to memory, it labels them. And from those labels, formation then begins assembling our responses, our interpretations, our downstream intentions, actions. And the remarkable thing we discover in this process is that identity is not something we possess in advance, but it emerges from the recursive repetition of these processes. The aggregates form loops: contact, tone, perception, formation, response. And when these loops repeat often enough, a pattern stabilizes, and these patterns become what we then call identity. A person begins believing they are a certain kind of self because certain loops repeat reliably. But once those loops stabilize, something else happens. Meaning begins to accumulate around these loops. Interpretation begins explaining the patterns. Stories begin organizing them. Narratives emerge. This is who I am. This is what the world is like. And this is how things make sense. So meaning is performing an extremely important function here. It's stabilizing continuity. Without meaning, the system would experience events as simply these disconnected fragments. So meaning is what stitches moments together. It creates coherence. But we also then discover that meaning performs a protective function. It begins protecting itself. And so once the system relies on a certain interpretation for continuity, those interpretations then become these defensive structures. When evidence contradicts them, the mind resists, it reinterprets, it deflects, it reshapes perception to preserve the narrative. And in this way, identity becomes a structure that protects its own coherence. And this brings us to the moment where insight can and begins to appear. Insight does not usually arise in the absence of tension. It arises precisely when the tension becomes impossible to resolve within the existing structure of meaning. And so as the system reaches a paradox, two things appear true. But the current framework, whatever it may be, cannot hold those two true things in simultaneity. So as meaning stretches and eventually something gives, we arrive at that moment where insight appears, but the insight is not necessarily a new explanation. More often, it is the recognition that the explanatory structure itself cannot hold. And this is where last week, week 6, took us, where we asked a question that follows naturally once conceptual explanation collapses. If meaning cannot stabilize experience, why does experience continue coherently? Why does perception still organize itself? Why do habits still recur? Why does the system remain structured? And what we discovered was subtle, but extremely important. Continuity does not require a carrier. Experience does not need a self to hold it together. Instead, continuity arises because each moment conditions the next. This is dependent origination seen directly. A sound occurs, a tone appears, perception organizes the sound, memory compares it to past sounds, formation produces interpretation, interpretation conditions response. Each moment shapes the probability of the next moment. Continuity, therefore, arises through this relational conditioning, not through the preservation of any substance. Nothing is carried forward, but the pattern of relation continues unfolding. And this insight dissolves something deep. It dissolves the assumption that experience requires a ground. But dissolving ground introduces a new situation because when ground dissolves, the system still continues. And we're left with the question, how does the system orient itself now? When conceptual ground dissolves, the system does not become blank. Experience does not disappear. Instead, the system begins reorganizing itself. The aggregates are still operating, contact continues, tone continues, perception continues, selecting, responding, forming, functioning continues. But the framework that previously organized those processes has weakened. Meaning can no longer stabilize identity. Interpretation can no longer hold absolute authority. Conceptual certainty has loosened, and this produces a very specific kind of instability. The system still requires orientation, but the structures that previously provided orientation are no longer reliable. And whenever a complex system loses a stabilizing framework, it attempts to find a new one. And this is exactly what happens after insight. The aggregates begin reorganizing around new centers of stability, and those new centers appear as distortions. Not because our practice is failing, but because the system is attempting to regain equilibrium. During the discussions this week, we examined 4 distortions that commonly arise at this stage of the training, each one representing a different strategy the system uses to stabilize itself after conceptual ground dissolves. The first distortion is subtle superiority, and this is identity reforming around insight itself. The mind recognizes that conceptual ground cannot hold, that identity cannot be secured, the reality is empty of intrinsic existence. But the system then reorganizes around the one who understands this, and so a new identity position appears as the one who sees, or the one who understands emptiness, or the one who is no longer caught. And this can be extremely subtle because nothing in the conceptual content seems incorrect, but phenomenologically, something has shifted. Instead of identity stabilizing around meaning, it's now stabilizing around insight itself, and so clarity becomes positional. This is the imaginary nature reappearing in a refined form. Intrinsic identity is now attributed not to ordinary views, but to a sort of spiritual understanding. And so this imaginary nature has not disappeared, but it has migrated. The second distortion is disengagement, and here, while we may recognize that identity is constructed and that experience is empty of intrinsic ground, this recognition may subtly alter how we then participate in the world. If experience is empty, if identity is constructed, if meaning cannot hold, then relational participation can begin to feel unnecessary. Why invest in relationships? Why participate in emotional dynamics if they seem optional? Why care about roles or responsibilities? Situations that previously carried urgency now feel strangely distant. And so while we may see very clearly, the fact clarity can become quite sharp, but participation decreases. Contact is no longer fully entered. Instead, experience is observed from a subtle distance. Phenomenologically, this can feel like spaciousness, but structurally, the system is no longer defending meaning, which is good, but it's also no longer inhabiting relationships. The mind has discovered emptiness, but not yet discovered intimacy. So disengagement is therefore emptiness interpreted at a distance. The field becomes quiet, but also less alive. This is not liberation, it's a protective distance. The third distortion is nihilistic drift. Once intrinsic ground disappears, motivation can weaken. If nothing possesses inherent meaning, why act? Why strive? Why care about consequence? Motivation begins to weaken, participation loses momentum, interest becomes diffuse. Disengagement still contains clarity. This distortion introduces collapse. The system no longer feels compelled to act. Consequences appear abstract. There's an energy drain from our participation, and so this nihilism is not a philosophical doctrine, but a psychological adaptation. It's the nervous system's way of escaping the burden of consequence. Phenomena arise through conditioning, then participation becomes more consequential, not less. The absence of intrinsic ground does not remove consequence. It reveals how deeply everything is connected. So the difference between these distortions is that disengagement preserves clarity, but it abandons intimacy. If phenomena arise through conditioning, then participation becomes more consequential, not less. But when emptiness is misread as negation of significance, the system drifts into this nothing matters sentiment. The final distortion that we only briefly touched upon was this hyper-clarity without warmth. Insight sharpens perception. Conceptual reification then becomes easier to see. Identity constructions become obvious, but the relational warmth does not automatically accompany this clarity. The mind becomes precise but cold. Interactions become analytical, and people become patterns. Relationship becomes observation. And this can appear highly insightful, but something essential is missing. Contact has, again, lost its composure. And so what all 4 distortions share is the same root. Insight dissolves conceptual ground, but insight alone does not stabilize participation. Identity has been seen through, at least partially, and yet the system continues to function. Contact continues, feeling, perception, formation. The aggregates have not stopped working. And so this demands careful investigation because it reveals a crucial misunderstanding that often appears in contemplative training, where many practitioners assume that once emptiness is recognized, the mechanisms of experience will just automatically reorganize themselves. But that assumption turns out to be dramatically incorrect. Insight reveals something about the nature of phenomena, but the aggregates are not governed by insight alone. They're governed by conditioning. If we once again slow this down and return to a very familiar sequence. Contact occurs, tone arises. Tone inclines our attention. Our attention shapes perception. Our perception triggers formations. Our formations produce a response. And this sequence unfolds extremely quickly, often before any sort of reflective awareness has time to intervene. And so insight does not erase that sequence, it just illuminates it. Even after recognizing emptiness, the aggregates are still operating through this conditioning. Perception biases remain, emotional reflexes remain, habitual responses remain. And this doesn't mean that our insight was false, it just means that insight and conditioning operate at different levels of the system. Insight belongs to recognition, whereas conditioning belongs to momentum. And momentum does not dissolve simply because recognition has occurred. Because of this difference, there's often a lag between insight and functioning. We may see clearly that identity is constructed, yet still react defensively in conversation. We may recognize that thoughts have no intrinsic substance, yet still feel pulled by familiar emotional patterns. And we may understand dependent origination intellectually and experientially, yet still participate in relationships in ways that recreate the same karmic loops. The aggregates operate through accumulated conditioning, and recognition alone does not immediately recondition them. This is why insight alone cannot regulate behavior. It can illuminate distortion, but illumination does not automatically reorganize momentum. Even when the imagined intrinsic identity, the imaginary nature, is seen through, the dependent nature continues. Dependent functioning does not stop simply because intrinsic existence is negated. Conditioning continues unfolding through these relational patterns, and the system has tendencies, it has preferences, it has interpretive habits, emotional biases. The difference is now that we can see them. And that's the first step to transforming them, but is not the same as transforming them. Transformation requires something else. If conditioning continues and nothing regulates it, the system will reorganize itself around the nearest available stabilizer. Before insight, that stabilizer was a conceptual identity. This means that, but after insight, those structures weaken. But the aggregates still require orientation. If nothing regulates those processes, that sequence of contact, tone, perception, formation, they'll reorganize around whatever stabilizing structure is available, which is why the distortions we described earlier appear so reliably. The system attempts to stabilize itself in new ways, and it may stabilize around insight itself. This becomes subtle superiority, or it may stabilize through distance. This becomes disengagement. If it stabilizes through collapse, this becomes the nihilistic drift. And if it stabilizes through analytic clarity, that becomes this hyperclarity without warmth. And none of these distortions mean the insight was wrong. They're just demonstrating that the aggregates are still organizing themselves around some referential point, some what we previously were referring to as identity, just doing so more subtly. So this brings us then to the central point, or perhaps culmination of this week. If insight alone cannot regulate the aggregates, then what can? What prevents conditioning from reorganizing itself around new distortions? And the answer is what we've been attempting to unearth in our discussions surrounding virtue this week. Virtue functions as a regulatory alignment within the field of contact, where insight reveals emptiness, virtue regulates participation. Insight dissolves conceptual fixation. Virtue stabilizes relational function. Without virtue, insight floats above the aggregates. With virtue, insight reshapes how the aggregates operate. So virtue is therefore not an ethical decoration added to awakening, but the mechanism through which awakening becomes embodied. And this is why the path eventually shifts in its emphasis. Earlier on, the training focused heavily on recognition, seeing clearly, understanding how experience forms, understanding how identity stabilizes, how meaning defends itself. But once those mechanisms are seen, the training cannot simply remain purely cognitive, perhaps. And so the question changes. It becomes, how does the system participate in experience once identity no longer provides orientation? Once we can, as we've been saying, no longer depend on any appearance or reference or representation to tell us what things are and therefore what to do. We can no longer confidently derive an ought from an is. And virtue answers that question. Virtue regulates contact, shapes response, redirects momentum, and gradually reconditions the aggregates themselves. And over time, conditioning becomes aligning with insight rather than contradicting it. That lag between seeing and functioning then begins to close. In the earlier weeks, when we were describing the emergence of fire, fire was the heat produced when insight meets attachment. Fire reveals distortion. Fire exposes clinging. But fire alone does not complete the path. Fire purifies, but purification must stabilize. And so virtue is the cooling of that fire, not the loss of clarity, but the integration of that clarity. Fire becomes radiance when it no longer burns through identity conflict. Radiance is clarity functioning relationally, and virtue is the condition that allows that radiance to appear. If virtue regulates participation, then what exactly is virtue? It is not this moral instruction, but a structural feature of enlightened activity. If we misunderstand virtue, we simply reduce it to behavior, and behavior alone cannot produce the alignment we are discussing. Now we need to look more carefully at what virtue actually is and how it functions within the path, particularly at the latter stages of the path. In most contexts, virtue is interpreted morally, a system of rules that govern conduct. And so from the perspective of awakening, these qualities appear naturally, but from the perspective of the path, they must be cultivated because conditioning still obscures them. To understand this, we need to shift perspectives slightly. When we talk about the Buddha, the victorious ones, this is not an entity in the ordinary sense. As we've mentioned before, Buddha is not simply an individual who has acquired insight. Buddha is a name given to the awakened functioning itself. So it is the form through which illumination becomes operative. And from this perspective, the virtues are not behaviors imposed from the outside, but are the qualities that naturally radiate from this activity. Think of the sun. The sun does not decide to emit light. Light is the natural expression of what the sun is. And that light possesses qualities: warmth, radiance, illumination, heat. These qualities are not separate objects that the sun carries. They're the way the sun functions. And the virtues operate in a similar way. They're the qualities that naturally accompany awakened functioning: patience, generosity, clarity, stability. These are not rules that the Buddha follows. They're the relational characteristics of a particular activity itself. Sentient beings do not perceive reality from the perspective of suchness. Their perception, our perception, is conditioned by appearance. We encounter phenomena through the distortions of conditioning. And because of that limitation, we cannot immediately recognize these qualities in their pure relational form. Instead, we encounter them through representation, and this is where the path begins. On the path, we relate to virtue through representation. We construct these directional distinctions: patient versus impatient, generous versus withholding, kind versus harsh. And these distinctions are not ultimate realities, but they are training devices that allow us to orient participation consciously. And without such distinctions, we would remain entirely subject to unconscious conditioning. But what must be understood here is that virtue cannot be measured by appearance alone. If we take patience as an example, we might think of patience as meaning waiting quietly for a long time. But the duration of waiting actually tells us almost nothing. A person may remain silent for an hour while inwardly boiling with resentment, while another may interrupt quickly but without hostility. And so externally the behaviors differ, but the virtue being expressed may not correspond to the behavior. Virtue is not defined by these surface performances, but by the composure of contact. Patience is the absence of friction in the encounter. Generosity is the absence of contraction in participation. Sila is the absence of distortion in relational movement. In other words, virtue is the composure of participation when identity is not defending itself, and this is why virtue cannot be reduced to behavioral rules. Behavior can imitate virtue without embodying it. We can sit and force ourselves or tell ourselves on being patient, waiting endlessly. But virtue is a quality of relational alignment. From the perspective of the path, training in virtue is a process of reconditioning. Sentient beings are conditioned to organize experience around identity protection, and virtue trains that system to organize experience around relational clarity instead. This training is not about becoming morally superior, but becoming structurally aligned with awakened functioning. And when participation becomes aligned with these qualities, the system becomes more capable of recognizing this suchness. Not because it's been created, but because the conditions that obscure it are weakening. And in this sense, the path in no way manufactures awakening, it just removes distortion. And these virtues are therefore not imposed, but the conditions that allow these qualities to become visible. So at this point, then, we can begin making a bit more sense about the paramitas, the perfections. We can understand them in this relational way as structural stabilizers, or what is structurally stabilized given a particular kind of participation. Dana, generosity, protects against identity consolidation. When the system is organized around self-preservation, it contracts, and generosity is what interrupts that contraction. But generosity is not measured by the quantity of giving. Giving a great deal while reinforcing identity is not generosity in this deeper sense. True generosity is the absence of possessiveness in participation. It's the recognition that nothing can be owned in a system of dependent origination. Virtue, sila, as we've been talking about it, stabilizes this, or is this stabilized relational integrity. When contact occurs, responses emerge, and this sila ensures that those responses do not distort the relational field. It ensures interactions are not manipulated where there is any aggressive or self-referential distortion. And in this sense, this virtue is the composure of contact itself. Patience metabolizes paradox. Without patience, the system attempts to resolve contradiction immediately, but paradox is precisely where our view matures. An instantiation of patience is what allows tension to remain without collapsing, and it keeps us open while fire illuminates distortion. Energy is sustaining engagement. Without energy, we drift towards disengagement or nihilism. An instantiation of this quality maintains participation even when the path becomes difficult. Meditative stability. This protects coherence. It allows the mind to remain unified without fragmenting. And this is the quality that we began cultivating in week 1. Without this stability, insight cannot remain integrated. Wisdom prevents reification. It protects the path from turning virtue into moral identity. When we look at all of these paramitas, we're not looking at them as insight removes the illusion of intrinsic ground, while virtue allows that participation to function without recreating that illusion. Without that virtue, insight becomes distortion, and with virtue, it becomes relational radiance. So let's revisit now the 4 earlier distortions through this lens. The distortion of subtle superiority was when insight appears, it becomes very easy for identity to reorganize around that clarity. And so we have this new identity emerging as the one who understands, or the one who sees through illusion. And this is distorting that moment of contact, seeking to validate prior insights, or the feeling of validation of prior insights as the one who sees. And this is a subtle form clinging to this sort of awakened identity. But what dissolves this distortion typically is generosity. Generosity breaks that tendency to consolidate around self-reference, because generosity recognizes that nothing that appears can be possessed, not wealth, not insight, And so generosity restores relational circulation, and instead of clarity becoming something that the self owns or that needs to be validated, it becomes something that flows. And when clarity flows rather than accumulates, identity has nowhere to stabilize. Generosity protects insight from becoming a position. As for disengagement, this was where we discussed how, while we may recognize emptiness, we may then begin withdrawing from relational life. And so experience becomes something observed rather than inhabited. And this distortion is arising because emptiness is interpreted as a form of distance. But it's not distance, it's relational intimacy, and virtue protects that intimacy. It stabilizes our participation and ensures that contact remains responsive rather than avoidant, not entangled in identity, but also not removed from the world. The third distortion we discussed was the nothing matters drift, where we conclude that nothing carries significance, and so we see our motivation weakening, our participation fading, and our energy draining. And this is, again, a misunderstanding of emptiness, because dependent origination means everything matters precisely because nothing exists independently. And so every action conditions the field, every response reshapes the relational environment. And so energy, exertion, protects against that collapse because it keeps participation alive to remain engaged in the unfolding of the conditions. And so it affirms that awakening does not remove responsibility, it intensifies it, because once we see dependent origination clearly, we realize that participation is always consequential. And the fourth distortion we discussed was that hyperclarity without warmth, because the system has learned to see clearly but has not yet learned to receive fully. Patience then stabilizes that receptivity. It allows experience to unfold without forcing it into conclusions. It restores warmth to the clarity because patience is what allows another being to exist without immediately reducing them to a pattern. The remaining two paramitas then, we could say, stabilize the entire system. Stability, and this meditative stability is what maintains coherence across all of these dynamics. Without it, we fragment. And we see the mind oscillating between extremes, clarity one moment, confusion the next. And so this meditative stability holds the field steady enough for virtue and wisdom to function together. And lastly, wisdom, prajna, protects the entire path from becoming another identity structure. Because even virtue can become a form of attachment. Wisdom dissolves that fixation because it remembers that none of these qualities belong to a self. Just as the sun does not possess light as an object, this awakening does not possess virtue as a property. It's simply how it appears in relationship. And so when we see the paramitas in this way, it becomes clear that they're not independent virtues, but they function as a sort of ecology. Generosity prevents identity consolidation, virtue stabilizes relational participation, patience metabolizes paradox, energy sustains engagement, stability produces and preserves coherence, and wisdom prevents reification. And together they create the conditions under which this Buddha activity functions and becomes possible as the natural expression of relational clarity. So up until now, we've been examining throughout the last 7 weeks the architecture of experience, asking questions about what is truth and what is true. But now we're looking at how do we participate? Because participation is the only place where view can stabilize. We can't rely on identity, conceptual certainty. So what remains is how we meet the moment, how we meet another being, and how we respond when conditions arise. Virtue is the composure of that meeting. And this brings us to something that the path eventually reveals. Insight is not the freedom from consequence. Insight is the freedom from ignorance about consequence. Dependent origination, karma, relationship, all of this continues. And if anything, insight reveals how intimate these processes really are. Every moment of contact reshapes the field. Every response conditions future experience. That this doesn't remove responsibility, but makes it unavoidable, because it's not the responsibility of a self trying to control or shoulder the world. It's the responsiveness of a system that understands it is inseparable from the world. So if we were to summarize this week very simply, insight dissolves conceptual ground, but insight alone does not stabilize participation. Without virtue, insight reorganizes around distortion. With it, it becomes relational integrity. And this is why wisdom is always paired with the paramitas. Wisdom reveals emptiness. Virtue allows that emptiness to function in the world. Together they form the living expression that is not separate from ordinary life, the next moment of contact, the next response, the next relationship. So that is where view becomes real.